Arlington National Cemetery lay solemn under the October sky, rows of white headstones stretching across manicured grounds like silent sentinels. A biting wind swept across the landscape, rustling the leaves of ancient oaks that had stood witness to decades of America's fallen being laid to rest with honor. Today, they would witness one more. The funeral procession for General William Iron Bill Montgomery approached the cemetery's entrance with military precision. 6 gleaming black cars followed the hearse, carrying the general's family. Behind them, a convoy of government vehicles transported high-ranking military officials, members of Congress, and even a former president. Security was extraordinary. Military police stood at attention along the route, while plainclothes Secret Service agents scanned the crowds. The general's 40-year military career had culminated in his role as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, making his funeral a matter of national security. Standing at the cemetery's entrance was Margaret Cooper, 72 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a navy blue dress beneath a well-worn wool coat, her only adornment a small silver pin on her lapel in the shape of a combat medic's insignia. In her gloved hands, she clutched a single white rose and a faded photograph. Margaret watched the procession from behind the security barriers, her eyes never leaving the flag-draped casket visible through the hearse's windows. Her face, weathered by time but still handsome, revealed little of the emotions churning within her. Only the occasional tremble of her chin suggested the depth of her feelings. As the last vehicle passed through the gates, Margaret took a deep breath and approached the security checkpoint. A young Marine stood guard, his face impassive. "I'm here for General Montgomery's service," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her age. The Marine regarded her with polite professionalism. "Your name, ma'am?" "Margaret Cooper." He checked the tablet in his hands, scrolling through the list of authorized attendees, his brow furrowed slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't see your name on the guest list." Margaret nodded as though she had expected this. "Could you check again, please? I've come a very long way." The Marine glanced at his superior, an older sergeant who stepped forward. "Ma'am, this is a restricted funeral service with authorized personnel only. Are you family?" "No," Margaret answered honestly. "Not family, but I knew the general a long time ago." The sergeant's expression softened slightly, but rules were rules. "I understand, ma'am, but without authorization, I can't allow you entry. Perhaps you could pay your respects after the service concludes." Margaret's eyes drifted past him to where the casket was being transferred to a horse-drawn caisson. The ceremonial unit moved with practiced precision, their white gloves a stark contrast against the dark wood of the casket. "I just thought," she began, then stopped herself. "Yes, of course, I understand." As she turned to leave, a young lieutenant who had been observing the exchange approached. "Excuse me, ma'am, that pin you're wearing, it's a Vietnam-era combat medic insignia, isn't it?" Margaret's hand instinctively rose to touch the small silver pin. "Yes, it is." "Did you serve?" he asked, curiosity evident in his voice. "I did, Army Nurse Corps, 1968 to 1971, Ku Kai and later Quang Tri." Her voice carried no boast, just a simple statement of fact. The lieutenant looked impressed. "That was rough country, ma'am." "It was," Margaret agreed, a distant look crossing her face. For a moment, it seemed the lieutenant might intervene on her behalf, but the arrival of a senior officer drew his attention away. With a respectful nod to Margaret, he returned to his duties. Margaret retreated to a bench just outside the security perimeter. From there, she could see much of the proceedings, though at a distance. She sat with the straight-backed posture of someone who had never quite left the military behind, the white rose still clutched in her hand. As the honor guard assembled and the family emerged from their vehicles, Margaret's eyes focused on a woman in her 50s, the general's daughter, Elizabeth. There was something of her father in her bearing, in the way she held her chin high despite her grief. Behind Elizabeth came the general's 2 sons, Michael and James, both in military dress uniforms adorned with their own hard-earned medals. They flanked their mother, Victoria, a dignified woman whose grief was evident even through her veiled hat. The family took their places beside the grave as the chaplain began the service. Though too far away to hear the words, Margaret could follow the familiar rhythms of a military funeral. The ceremonial folding of the flag, the rifle salute, the mournful notes of taps floating across the cemetery grounds. Margaret closed her eyes as the bugle played, memories washing over her like waves. Not of this cemetery or this day, but of distant jungles and makeshift field hospitals, of helicopter rotors and shouted orders, of blood and bandages, and a young captain named Bill Montgomery who had arrived on her operating table more dead than alive. A single tear traced down her weathered cheek, quickly wiped away. She had not cried in many years, not since receiving news of her husband's death a decade earlier. But today, the grief felt fresh and raw, as though the intervening 50 years had suddenly collapsed. As the formal service concluded and attendees began to offer personal condolences to the family, Margaret stood. Perhaps now, with the official ceremony complete, she might approach and pay her respects. But the security remained tight, and she hesitated, uncertain. She unfolded the photograph she had been holding, yellowed with age, its edges worn soft from years of handling. In it, a young nurse with dark hair pulled back under a cap stood beside a bandaged officer sitting in a wheelchair. Despite his injuries, he was smiling up at her, his hand covering hers on the wheelchair's handle. On the back, faded blue ink read, "Capt. Montgomery and Lt. Cooper, 85th Evac Hospital, July 1969. Margaret traced her finger over the image, then carefully refolded it and placed it back in her pocket. Some memories were best kept private, especially on a day like today. As she prepared to leave, Margaret took one last look at the gathered mourners. To her surprise, she found Elizabeth Montgomery staring in her direction, a curious expression on her face. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance. Then Margaret turned and walked away, her back straight, her head held high, just as she had been taught all those years ago when she first put on her uniform. She would not intrude where she was not welcome, no matter what she carried in her heart. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Margaret Cooper that day. Elizabeth Montgomery stood beside her father's casket, accepting condolences with the gracious strength expected of a general's daughter. She had grown up in the military world and understood the importance of protocol and composure, especially in public. Today, she represented not just her family but also her father's legacy. Yet even as she shook hands with senators and exchanged quiet words with fellow officers, part of her mind remained fixed on the elderly woman she had glimpsed beyond the security perimeter, a woman who had been turned away despite her evident desire to pay respects. "Lizzie," her brother Michael's voice drew her attention back to the present. "The Secretary of Defense wants to speak with you." Elizabeth nodded and turned to greet the cabinet member, but her thoughts continued to drift. There had been something familiar about that woman, something she couldn't quite place. When the last dignitary had offered condolences, the family gathered for a moment of privacy before the reception. Victoria Montgomery, their mother, adjusted her husband's medals in the display case that would be presented at the reception. "He would have hated all this fuss," she said softly, a small smile playing at her lips despite her red-rimmed eyes. "But he deserved every bit of it," James, the younger son, replied. "Dad never wanted recognition, which is exactly why he should receive it." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, but found herself glancing back toward the cemetery entrance. "Did either of you notice an elderly woman being turned away at the security checkpoint, wearing a navy dress and coat?" Michael shook his head, but their mother looked up with sudden interest. "A woman? What did she look like?" "Silver hair, probably in her 70s. She was wearing some kind of pin, military, I think. The guards wouldn't let her in." Victoria's hand stilled on the medal display. "Was she still there after the service?" "I think so. I saw her watching from a distance." Something passed across Victoria's face, a shadow of recognition quickly replaced by her usual composed expression. "Probably just someone who admired your father's service," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Elizabeth might have pressed further, but the cemetery director approached to escort them to the reception at Fort Myer Officers Club. The question of the unknown woman was set aside as the family was ushered into waiting cars. The reception was everything expected of a four-star general's memorial, dignified, well-attended, with carefully selected photographs chronicling William Montgomery's distinguished career. Elizabeth stood near a display of her father's early service years, including his time in Vietnam, where he had earned his first Silver Star. Her attention was drawn to a particular photograph she had helped select for the display, her father as a young captain, standing with his unit in Vietnam. He looked impossibly young, his face unlined by the decades of command decisions that would follow. He was so proud of that combat infantry unit, came her mother's voice beside her. Said they were the finest men he ever served with. Elizabeth nodded, studying the faces of the young soldiers surrounding her father. He told us so many stories about Vietnam, but sometimes I wonder how much he left out. A great deal, Victoria said quietly. There were parts of the war he could never bring himself to discuss, even with me. They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in thoughts of the man they had loved in different ways. Mom, Elizabeth said hesitantly, who was Margaret? Victoria's sharp intake of breath was answer enough that the name held significance. Why do you ask? Her mother replied carefully. Last year when Dad was in the hospital after his first stroke, I heard him say that name. He was half asleep, and when I asked, he just said she was someone he knew during the war. Elizabeth turned to face her mother directly. Was she important to him? Victoria was quiet for so long that Elizabeth thought she might not answer. Finally, she sighed. Margaret Cooper. She was a nurse with the Army Nurse Corps. She saved your father's life in Vietnam. He never mentioned her to us. No, he wouldn't have. Victoria's eyes drifted to the photograph. Some memories were too painful, even the good ones, especially the good ones. Before Elizabeth could ask what she meant, Michael approached with a senior Army official who wanted to speak with Victoria. With a meaningful glance at her daughter, Victoria moved away, leaving Elizabeth alone with her thoughts and a name that seemed to hold unexpected weight, Margaret Cooper. As the reception continued, Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the windows that overlooked the cemetery grounds. On impulse, she pulled out her phone and searched for Margaret Cooper, Vietnam nurse. Several results appeared, including a brief mention in a digital archive of Vietnam War medical personnel. Lieutenant Margaret Cooper had served with distinction at several evacuation hospitals, earning a Bronze Star for valor during the Tet Offensive when her hospital came under attack. Elizabeth continued scrolling until she found an old newspaper article from 1987 about a reunion of Vietnam medical personnel. The grainy photograph showed a group of middle-aged nurses, and among them stood a woman identified as Margaret Cooper, former Army Nurse Corps. Even in the poor-quality image, Elizabeth could see the resemblance to the woman she had glimpsed at the cemetery. Could it be the same person, after all these years? Her thoughts were interrupted when James appeared at her side, concern evident in his expression. Are you all right, Liz? You've been standing here for 20 minutes. Elizabeth showed him the search results on her phone. I think the woman who was turned away at the cemetery might be someone who saved Dad's life in Vietnam. James studied the article with growing interest. Did Dad ever mention her to you? Never, but Mom just confirmed she existed. Elizabeth hesitated. I think she might still be here, James. She seemed very determined. Her brother's expression softened. Then we should find her, if she came all this way and if she was important to Dad. Elizabeth nodded, decision made. I'll check outside. Can you discreetly ask security if they know where she went? As James moved away, Elizabeth slipped out a side entrance of the officers' club, scanning the grounds. The autumn afternoon was fatting, shadows lengthening across the manicured lawns. At first, she saw no one, but then she noticed a solitary figure seated on a bench near the memorial garden, facing toward Arlington Cemetery. Even from a distance, Elizabeth recognized the navy blue coat and the straight-backed posture. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the elderly woman, uncertain of what she would say but knowing with absolute certainty that this was something she needed to do, for her father, for this unknown woman, and perhaps for herself as well. As she approached, the woman looked up, her weathered face showing surprise and then a careful neutrality that reminded Elizabeth of her father's own disciplined expressions. Excuse me, Elizabeth said gently. Are you Margaret Cooper? The woman's eyes, clear blue despite her age, widened slightly. I am. Elizabeth extended her hand. I'm Elizabeth Montgomery. William Montgomery was my father. Margaret slowly rose from the bench, her dignity evident in every movement. She took Elizabeth's offered hand, her grip surprisingly strong. I know who you are, she said softly. You look very much like him. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, two women connected by a man who had meant everything to both of them, though in very different ways. You tried to attend the funeral, Elizabeth said. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. I wanted to pay my respects. Your father he was a good man. Why didn't you contact us directly? We would have made arrangements." The older woman's smile held a lifetime of stories. "It didn't seem appropriate. It's been over 50 years and your father had his life, his family." She paused, looking out toward the cemetery where the general now rested. "I just needed to say goodbye." Elizabeth studied Margaret's face, seeing in it both strength and a carefully contained grief. Whatever this woman had been to her father, whatever memories they shared, the connection had endured for half a century. "Ms. Cooper," Elizabeth said decisively, "I think you should join us at the reception. There are people there who would want to meet you, including my mother." Margaret looked genuinely startled. "Your mother, Victoria, knows who I am." "She does," Elizabeth confirmed, "and I think she's been expecting you in a way." As understanding passed between them, James appeared, walking briskly toward them. He stopped short when he saw Margaret, a flash of recognition crossing his face though they had never met. "You have his eyes," Margaret said quietly to James as he joined them. James smiled, the resemblance to his father momentarily striking. "So I've been told. I'm James Montgomery." "Margaret Cooper." "The nurse who saved our father's life," James said, his tone respectful. "We've just learned about you today, but it seems we owe you a great debt." Margaret shook her head. "I was just doing my job, like all of us were." Elizabeth gently touched Margaret's arm. "Please, come with us. There's clearly a story here that we should hear, and I think my father would have wanted you to be properly welcomed." After a moment's hesitation, Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "If you're certain." "We are," the siblings replied in unison. As they walked back toward the officers' club, Elizabeth noticed that Margaret had straightened her simple dress and adjusted the silver pin on her lapel, small gestures of a woman preparing to face something significant with dignity. Whatever connection this woman had shared with their father, Elizabeth sensed it was more complex and meaningful than a simple wartime encounter. And as they approached the reception, she couldn't help but wonder what other aspects of her father's life remained unknown to his children, preserved only in the memories of those who had known him when history was being written in blood and sacrifice. The officers' club reception hall fell silent as Elizabeth and James Montgomery entered with Margaret Cooper between them. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glasses of bourbon and wine hovered halfway to lips. Curious glances darted toward the unfamiliar elderly woman being escorted by the general's children. Victoria Montgomery stood near the center of the room, speaking with the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When she turned and saw Margaret, her composed expression faltered for just an instant. A flash of recognition, followed by something more complex. Not quite surprise, not quite apprehension, but a strange mixture of both. "Mother," Elizabeth said as they approached, "we'd like you to meet Margaret Cooper." Victoria's response surprised both her children. "I know who she is," she said softly, then extended both hands to take Margaret's. "It's been a very long time, Margaret." "Hello, Victoria," Margaret replied, her voice equally gentle. "You're as elegant as ever." The two women regarded each other for a long moment, not as rivals, but as people who had once occupied different but equally important places in a good man's life. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Margaret admitted. "Bill would have wanted you here," Victoria said with quiet certainty. "He spoke of you often." This revelation clearly startled Elizabeth and James. Their father had never mentioned Margaret to his children, yet apparently had spoken of her to their mother. Around them, the reception guests had begun to murmur. A three-star general approached, his face registering surprise as he looked at Margaret. "Lieutenant Cooper," he asked incredulously, "from the 85th Evac." Margaret turned, studying the general's face before recognition dawned. "Bobby Fletcher, is that you under all those stars?" The general, now in his 70s himself, broke into a broad grin. "It's General Fletcher now, but yes, ma'am." He turned to the Montgomery family. "This woman patched me up after I caught some shrapnel outside Quang Tri, best damn nurse in Vietnam." More veterans began to approach, men who had served with General Montgomery in his later commands, but who had also known Margaret during the war. The whispers spread through the room. This was that nurse from Vietnam, the one who had saved the young Captain Montgomery when his patrol had been ambushed near the Cambodian border. Victoria gently guided Margaret to a quiet corner of the reception, away from the growing interest. Elizabeth and James followed, their curiosity now impossible to contain. I think it's time they knew, Margaret, Victoria said, gesturing to her children. They should hear it from you. Margaret looked uncertain. Are you sure, after all these years? Victoria nodded. Bill would want them to know, especially today. Margaret took a deep breath and reached into her pocket, withdrawing the faded photograph she had been carrying. She handed it to Elizabeth. This was taken in July 1969, about 3 weeks after your father was brought to my field hospital, Margaret began, her voice taking on the steady rhythm of a story long held but never forgotten. His patrol had been ambushed. He was the only survivor, and barely that, multiple gunshot wounds, severe blood loss, the beginning of infection. Elizabeth studied the photograph, seeing her father as a young man, bandaged but smiling up at the dark-haired nurse standing beside his wheelchair. We didn't expect him to survive the first night, Margaret continued. But your father was stubborn even then. He fought through the fever, through the surgeries, through the pain. And when he was conscious enough to speak, he asked me to write letters for him to his men's families. He wanted to tell them personally how their sons and husbands had died, James said softly, understanding immediately. That sounds like Dad. Margaret nodded. He dictated 12 letters over the course of a week, each one personal, each one honoring the man it described. By the end, he was exhausted, but he said it was his duty as their commander. Victoria touched the photograph gently. That's when you knew, wasn't it? Yes, Margaret admitted, looking at Victoria with open honesty. That's when I knew the kind of man he was. Elizabeth looked between the two women, sensing the unspoken current of shared understanding. What happened then? Margaret's expression softened with memory. Your father spent 6 weeks at our hospital. I was assigned as his primary nurse. We talked a lot during those weeks about the war, about home, about what waited for us afterward. She paused. We became close. They fell in love, Victoria said simply, surprising her children with her directness. It happens in war, the intensity, the closeness to death, the need for human connection. Margaret's eyes widened slightly at Victoria's candor, but she nodded in confirmation. Your father was the most honorable man I'd ever met. When he was finally evacuated to Japan for further treatment, he promised to write. A small smile touched her lips. And he did, every week for the rest of my tour. But you didn't stay together, James observed. He met Mom a year later. I was reassigned to a hospital in Quang Tri, Margaret explained. The fighting was intense there, the casualties overwhelming. Your father was sent back to his unit after recovery, then eventually rotated home. She looked at Victoria. By the time I returned to the States in late 1970, he had met your mother. Victoria took up the narrative. Bill told me about Margaret on our second date. He said there was a nurse in Vietnam who had saved more than his life. She had saved his humanity during the darkest period of the war. She reached out to touch Margaret's hand. He wanted me to know because he believed in honesty, especially about matters of the heart. Elizabeth was struggling to reconcile this new dimension of her father. But he never mentioned you to us, Ms. Cooper, not once in all our lives. Margaret nodded, understanding. Some memories from war are too complex to explain to children. Your father and I, what we shared belonged to a different world, a different time. He built this life, this family, and it was right that he focused on that. But you kept track of him, James said. It wasn't a question. From a distance, Margaret acknowledged. I followed his career in the news. I saw when he received his first star, then his second. I read about his command in Desert Storm, his promotion to 4-star general. Her voice softened. I was proud of him, though he never knew it. Victoria surprised them again. He knew Margaret, he always knew. A senior aide approached, discreetly signaling that it was time for the family to begin saying their goodbyes to the guests. The reception was drawing to a close. Will you stay? Elizabeth asked Margaret impulsively. After the reception, we have so many questions. Margaret glanced at Victoria, clearly uncertain. Please do, Victoria said with genuine warmth. Bill would want us to talk, all of us. As the family moved to fulfill their social obligations, Margaret found herself momentarily alone, still holding the photograph of herself and the young captain who would become a general. She traced his face with a gentle finger, remembering the man he had been when they had known each other, brave, honorable, and so very young. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs standing before her, his expression solemn. Lieutenant Cooper, he said formally, On behalf of the United States military, I want to thank you for your service, both in Vietnam and in saving a man who would go on to lead our armed forces with distinction. Margaret stood, instinctively straightening to attention despite the decades since she had worn a uniform. Thank you, sir, but I was just one of many nurses who served. Perhaps, he acknowledged, but according to General Montgomery's private papers, you were the one who made all the difference. Margaret's expression revealed her surprise. His private papers. The chairman nodded. The general left detailed instructions for his personal archives. Your name appears prominently in his journal from Vietnam and in several letters he wrote but never sent. He paused. He credited you with showing him the true meaning of courage during a time when he most needed to be reminded. As the chairman moved away, Margaret stood very still, absorbing this unexpected revelation. All these years, she had preserved her memories of William Montgomery, never knowing he had done the same with his memories of her. Across the room, she saw Victoria watching her, a look of gentle understanding on her face. Whatever had passed between them, the general, the nurse who had loved him, and the woman he had ultimately married, seemed to have reached a kind of resolution in Victoria's mind long before this day. Margaret tucked the photograph back into her pocket, just as Elizabeth returned to her side. The car will take Mother home soon, she said, but we thought, if you'd like to visit his grave once more, this time properly, the cemetery director has arranged private access for family. Margaret felt a swell of emotion at being included in this intimate gesture. I would be honored, she said simply. As they prepared to leave, several of the remaining veterans approached to shake Margaret's hand, each with a story of how Lieutenant Cooper had cared for them or their buddies during the worst days of their lives. To these men, she wasn't just a footnote in General Montgomery's life. She was a legend in her own right, one of the unsung heroes of a war that had defined their generation. The security guards who had blocked her entry hours earlier now stood at respectful attention as she passed, included now among the general's honored guests. The transformation from outsider to welcomed guest had happened so completely that it seemed as though the earlier rejection had been a mistake now rightfully corrected. As they walked toward the waiting cars, Victoria fell into step beside Margaret. He wanted to contact you, you know, many times over the years. Why didn't he? Margaret asked softly. Victoria's smile held a lifetime of understanding. The same reason you never contacted him, respect for boundaries, for the lives you had both built. She paused. And perhaps a fear that some memories are best preserved exactly as they were, without the complications of the present. Margaret nodded, recognizing the truth in Victoria's words. He was lucky to have found you. We were both lucky, Victoria replied. And now it seems our luck continues. He brought us together finally in his own way. As twilight settled over Arlington National Cemetery, the two women who had loved William Montgomery in different ways, but with equal depth, walked side by side, no longer separated by time or circumstance, but united in their shared connection to a remarkable man's life and legacy. Arlington National Cemetery was transformed in the fading light. The white headstones caught the sunset's glow, creating an almost ethereal landscape of honor and remembrance. The crowds had dispersed, the official ceremonies concluded. Now, in the growing quiet, the Montgomery family and Margaret Cooper made their way back to the general's fresh grave. A lone Marine honor guard remained, standing vigilant despite the lateness of the hour. He came to attention as they approached, recognizing Victoria and her children. At ease, Sergeant, Victoria said gently. We've come for a private moment. The Marine nodded respectfully and stepped back to a discreet distance, maintaining his watch but allowing the family their space. General Montgomery's grave was marked temporarily with a simple plaque until the permanent headstone could be placed. The freshly turned earth was covered with flowers from the earlier ceremony, along with small mementos left by fellow soldiers, challenge coins, unit patches, and other symbols of military brotherhood. Margaret stood slightly apart, allowing the family their moment. She had removed the white rose from her purse, holding it carefully as she watched Victoria adjust some of the flower arrangements. Elizabeth noticed Margaret's hesitation and moved to her side. Please, she said softly, you belong here too. With gentle encouragement, Margaret approached the grave. She knelt carefully despite her age and placed the white rose among the other flowers. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object and tucked it partially beneath the rose, a faded yellow ribbon that had once been bright gold. Victoria noticed and drew in a sharp breath of recognition. "His medical evacuation tag," she said quietly. "You kept it all these years." Margaret nodded. "He gave it to me the day he was transferred to Japan, said it might bring me luck." Her voice grew softer. "I carried it through the rest of my tour, every mass casualty, every rocket attack. Somehow it did seem to keep me safe." James helped Margaret to her feet, his father's eyes looking out from his younger face. "Dad kept something of yours too," he said. "A handkerchief with your initials. It was always in his deployment kit, through every conflict, every tour. We found it in his personal effects." The revelation brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. "He never told me." "There's a lot he never said directly," Victoria acknowledged. "But in his final years, especially after his first stroke, he spoke of Vietnam more often, of you." The family formed a small circle around the grave, connected now by shared memories of the man they had all loved in different ways. As the cemetery fell into deeper twilight, Victoria suggested they move to the car, where they could be more comfortable. The Marine Guard would remain through the night, keeping watch over his general. In the spacious government vehicle, with privacy screens separating them from the driver, Victoria opened her purse and removed a sealed envelope. "William left specific instructions about his funeral," she explained, "including this letter to be opened afterward." She handed it to Margaret. "It's addressed to you." Margaret stared at the envelope, her name written in a strong, familiar hand. "I don't know if I can read this now," she said, her voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "You don't have to," Elizabeth assured her. "But before you decide, there's something else you should know." She exchanged glances with her mother, who nodded encouragement. "Dad left detailed journals about his time in Vietnam. In them, he credited you with something beyond saving his life." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "He was the sole survivor of his patrol," James explained. 12 men under his command died in that ambush. In his journals, he wrote that he had decided to resign his commission once he recovered. He couldn't forgive himself for living when his men had died. Victoria took up the narrative. "But according to what he wrote, you convinced him that the best way to honor their sacrifice was to continue serving, to become the kind of officer who would never forget the human cost of war." "I remember that conversation," Margaret said softly. "It was during his darkest night, when the fever was high and the pain was at its worst. He said he didn't deserve to live when better men had died. And you told him that surviving wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility," Elizabeth said, quoting from her father's journal. Margaret nodded, memory washing over her. "I told him that every life he saved, every soldier he protected through wise leadership would be a tribute to those men." Her eyes grew distant. "I didn't know if he even heard me. He was barely conscious." "He heard you," Victoria assured her. "And he never forgot. Those words shaped the rest of his career. His insistence on visiting wounded soldiers, his caution about committing troops to harm's way, his willingness to challenge civilian leadership when he felt operations were being ordered without adequate concern for casualties." Michael, who had been quietly observing until now, leaned forward. "Dad mentored 3 generations of officers with that same philosophy. The ripple effect of your words changed the culture of command for countless units." Margaret absorbed this information with growing wonder. "I had no idea," she said finally. "I was just a young lieutenant trying to help a wounded captain find his way through grief." "You were far more than that," Victoria said gently. "To William, you represented everything noble about service, compassion without weakness, duty without coldness." The car had reached their destination, Victoria's home in Alexandria, where the family would spend the evening together before departing to their separate lives the next day. As they walked toward the front door, Margaret finally gathered the courage to open the letter. Inside, the general's familiar handwriting filled a single page. "My dear Margaret Asterisk, if you are reading this, then you came to say goodbye, just as I always knew you would. Some connections transcend time and circumstance. What we shared during those weeks in Vietnam has remained one of the most profound experiences of my life. You saved more than my body. You saved my soul when I was closest to losing it. In the years that followed, through a blessed marriage, the joy of children, and a career of service, I have carried the memory of your courage and compassion as a touchstone. Whenever faced with difficult decisions, I would ask myself what the lieutenant with steady hands and unflinching eyes would do. Victoria has known about you from the beginning. The love I found with her was different but equally meaningful, and in her wisdom, she understood that the heart is capable of holding many loyalties without diminishing any of them. My only regret is that I lacked the courage to reach out to you in later years, to tell you how profoundly you influenced the man I became. Perhaps I feared disturbing the perfect memory of what we shared in that time out of time. If my family has found you and given you this letter, know that they do so with my blessing and Victoria's grace. The artificial boundaries that kept us apart in life need not persist beyond it. With eternal gratitude and enduring love, asterisk. Bill asterisk. Margaret lowered the letter, tears falling freely now. Victoria moved to her side and gently took her hand. You are part of his legacy, she said simply, and therefore part of our family. Inside the house, surrounded by photographs of William Montgomery's life, as a young officer, as a father, as a distinguished general, Margaret began to share stories she had held close for 5 decades. Stories of a wounded captain's courage, of quiet conversations during long hospital nights, of promises made and kept in different ways than either of them could have imagined. The Montgomery children listened, filling in gaps in their understanding of their father, seeing him through the eyes of someone who had known him when he was vulnerable, when his character was being forged in the crucible of war and suffering. As the evening progressed, Margaret revealed that she had never married. There were opportunities, she explained, but no one ever quite measured up to a certain captain I once knew. She smiled at Victoria. I made a different choice than he did, but I never regretted it. Victoria nodded in understanding. Different paths, both honorable. When Margaret finally prepared to leave, Elizabeth asked where she was staying. I have a hotel room near the airport, Margaret replied. My flight back to Oregon is tomorrow afternoon. Nonsense, Victoria said firmly. You'll stay here tonight, and tomorrow before you leave we have something to show you. The next morning, Victoria drove Margaret to a small private ceremony at the Pentagon. There, in a quiet conference room, several senior officers had gathered to honor Lieutenant Margaret Cooper's service with a long-overdue commendation. The paperwork, they explained, had been initiated by General Montgomery years earlier, but had been delayed by administrative oversights. The general was most insistent that this recognition be formalized, the current Army Surgeon General explained. He considered it a personal mission to ensure your service was properly acknowledged. As Margaret accepted the commendation, she understood that William had found yet another way to reach across time to honor their connection. He had ensured that her service would be recognized officially, her name recorded among those who had served with distinction. Later, as Victoria drove her to the airport, Margaret gazed out at the passing Virginia landscape. He built a wonderful life, she said. A beautiful family and honorable career. I'm glad I got to see it, even just this glimpse. He would have wanted you to know something else, Victoria said. The medical center at Fort Belvoir, the one he championed funding for after he retired. He insisted it include a state-of-the-art nursing education facility. She paused. It's called the Cooper Center for Nursing Excellence. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. I had no idea. Few people know the namesake, Victoria explained. He kept that connection private, but he wanted your legacy to continue influencing military medicine just as you had influenced him. As they said their goodbyes at the airport, Victoria pressed a small box into Margaret's hands. He wanted you to have this. It was in his instructions. Inside was a simple silver compass, its case engraved with the medical caduceus and the words, "To MC, you pointed the way. WM." He carried it in Vietnam, Victoria explained. It was in his pocket the day his patrol was ambushed. The impact of a bullet dented the case but deflected just enough to miss his heart. Margaret closed her fingers around the compass, feeling the weight of history and connection in her palm. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Come back for Christmas, Victoria said impulsively. The children would love it, and so would I. William would have wanted us to know each other better. As her plane took off, Margaret looked down at Arlington National Cemetery in the distance, where William Montgomery now rested among generations of American heroes. The guards had blocked her yesterday, not knowing who she was or what she had meant to the general they honored. But the general had known, had always known. and in his final act of leadership had ensured that the barriers between his worlds would finally fall. Margaret opened the compass, watching the needle swing steadily north, true and unwavering, like the love they had carried silently for 50 years, and like the connections that remained even after saying goodbye.